freedom is not free. Discover what it takes. It's time to tap and move forward.
Hello and welcome to Tap and Move Forward. I'm your host, Lynn Shelley. I'm excited to introduce you to a friend of mine, Scott Carnevale. This is the man who took me skydiving. On top of his thrill for adventure, he has an interesting military background. He attended the Naval Academy and later became an F-18 fighter pilot as a Marine. He is obsessed with personal growth and has some great insights on what it takes to be phenomenal. Here's the interview with Scott Carnevale. Why did you join the military and how old were you?
For me, I knew that I wanted to serve in the military really from my childhood. And I can't tell you from where that came, honestly, but it was just something I always wanted. And so I was very committed to it. I wanted to go to a school that offered JROTC, and was very committed to the service academies. It was the only school to which I applied, was the United States Naval Academy. And I got accepted at the Naval Academy. I went there. I was actually 17 when I got to the academy. In July, I checked in on July 3rd, and I turned 18 on August 8th. So technically 17 years old when I joined the military.
When you got to the Naval Academy, was it a surprising change? Did you feel any culture shock coming into that new situation, or were you already prepared and ready for it?
I think that I was more prepared than most of my classmates. We were arranged in platoons and companies. So despite the fact that it's the Naval Academy, they still kind of followed an infantry structure. And most of my classmates, we generally, although we operated and took pride in being a part of a company, it was really our platoons that of about 35 of us, 36, who were together, and we stayed together for 4 years. But my classmates, some of them came from very civilian backgrounds, and some came from the enlisted side as well. So we had some guys who had been in the military before as enlisted, and then some who had gone through NAPS, which is the Naval Academy Preparatory School. They were very well prepared. But the vast majority of my classmates were not. They were straight from the civilian world. They hadn't even experienced JROTC or really put a ton of thought into the military and understanding it. But so overall, I think I was better positioned than most and had a better understanding of it, having spent 6 years in an all-male military academy before I went to the Naval Academy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But, and I guess we didn't really cover that, but so I spent 6 years of my life before I went to the Naval Academy at a school in New York, which better prepared me for what I was about to experience. So it wasn't as massive of a culture shock as it was for others.
Was it your choice to go to that preparatory school?
It was. And I worked very hard in grade school in order to be able to get an academic scholarship to go to this school because
Wow.
I wanted it.
If you could give any advice to a newly enlisted member, what would it be?
Focus on the job at hand and focus on why you came into the military. If you did it specifically with the goal of serving your 3 or 4 year commitment and you're doing it for the GI Bill, especially in order to be able to go to college, I think that's a very noble endeavor in and of itself. You're serving your country, and stay focused on that. Work hard, put your head down, work hard, and stick to it. The other thing that I would tell you, and this is the part that you've heard me say before, is be very careful about marriage. I'm not discouraging marriage as an institution or anything like that. That's not where this is going to go. But I will say for the new enlisted, especially when they are 18, 19, 20 years old, is that they are put into base housing, which is not exactly an ideal situation. And the military dangles a very large carrot in front of the enlisted that if they get married, they will get to live off base. They'll get a number of financial incentives, and that can be very alluring, but it is potentially dangerous. You are in the military, you are going to deploy, You're going to spend long periods of time away from your loved one. That's going to be difficult on you and difficult on them. If you start to add other challenges, especially children, early in your life, that creates a very difficult situation. And if you ask around, you're going to find that a number of people who have served in the military have gone through a divorce. So just be very careful about that. I know you'll be going into marriage for all the right reasons, but it can be very challenging.
What was the scariest or most difficult part of your career, and how did you deal with it?
Honestly, the scariest part about doing what I did, and I don't know if that's the right word, whether it's challenging, there were a number of aspects. As you know, I flew F-18s in the Marine Corps, and the F-18 is kind of a unique animal in that it is a jack of all trades and master of none airplane. Even the F-16 or some of the other airplanes that are supposedly dual role or multifaceted don't quite do that. The F-16s have a tendency to focus on air to ground. As a squadron, they're an air to ground squadron, or they're harm shooters, which means they knock out radar sites, or they are air to air specific. In the F-18 community, we tend to truly run the gamut, and you are in a constant state of being disqualified potentially for any number of things. Hey, I haven't done air to ground in a while. I haven't done air to air. I haven't done aerial refueling. I haven't done FAC-A, which is forward air control airborne, or TAC-A, which is tactical control of the battlefield, or Recce, where you have a camera in the nose. There are just so many aspects. So the biggest challenge that we faced in the Hornet community was really trying to maintain your qualifications. And I can remember this epiphanous moment that I experienced in California doing a low level at night with night vision goggles, so NVGs, and with live ordnance on the airplane. And I remember thinking to myself as I was screaming along, doing probably 420 knots, about 450 miles an hour, low level through the mountains, and just thinking to myself, this is incredibly dangerous. I shouldn't be out here doing this right now. It was fun. I'm sure I had a smile on my face as I was thinking that, but there were definitely moments like that. I don't know that it was truly the scariest, but it was that moment of clarity. Like, I had other scary moments I could talk to you about, carrier qualification. The thing was, I don't know that I was actually smart enough to be scared. I think I was just focused. And that's what the military does, by the way, as a segue, is that fear is oftentimes replaced by the experience that you have. They've prepared you very well as they can for those moments. But there are still some moments where fear or being scared can kind of creep in. But in the end, you rely on your training.
How did you deal with big challenges in your career?
I've always welcomed them. Challenges for me, from a very early age, I am kind of an oddball in that I love to be tested. I don't know why. Where other people have a tendency, they get anxious, experience that anxiety, or they start to sweat at just even the prospect of being tested. And for whatever reason, I've craved it. I love to be asked questions. I love to learn from the experience. Even if I get something wrong, I can learn from those challenges. So whatever challenge it was, whether it was an academic challenge or an intellectual challenge or a physical challenge, I've always sought them out. So, and this harkens back to something we talked about, which is that obsession with personal development and growth, and how you learn is through mistakes generally and failures. And, I told you that one of my favorite phrases is, or concepts, is that it is not win or lose, but win or learn. And so if I don't succeed, if I don't win, if I lose, if you to use that term, I should use it as a learning opportunity. And I gave you the quote earlier, where it was, ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. So challenges, in my mind, were growth opportunities. And I've just always seen it that way.
When you started at the Naval Academy, did you know that you were going to become a fighter pilot at that point?
I did not know, and I don't know if that's how you intended to phrase that question, but I didn't know that I would be a fighter pilot. It's not something that any of us walk into with a contract that says, oh, okay, you're in the pipeline to be on this particular path. You walk into the Naval Academy, really it's unscripted. You're just a midshipman. You're going to put in your 4 years there, and you're going to go through a selection night in your senior year where you're ranked, and then there are a certain number of available slots for aviation or surface warfare, submarine warfare, general unrestricted line, Marine Corps. Even within the Marine Corps, there are ground assignable, aviation, MOSs, military occupation specialties, and even in the aviation side, there are pilots, and then there are naval flight officers, guys who don't exactly fly, but fly along. They ride along in airplanes. So it's really something that is up to you and how you come out of it at the end, how much success you've had, that will determine into what pipeline you can go. And then, of course, there are things that can go wrong. For example, a classmate of mine, outstanding guy, worked his tail off the entire time that we were at the Naval Academy. And we went into the medical review process. And as you can imagine, there are prerequisites for going into the aviation pipeline, whether it's eyesight, and there are some other things that would shock someone, like the measurement from your knee to your rear end. You can be too long or too short. It can be too long where you can't be on an ejection seat. And they're like, well, you're qualified to be a pilot, but you're only going to be able to fly P3s or bigger airplanes, like now the P6. You can't be on an ejection seat. Or it can be too short where you can't be on an ejection seat. And it's like, well, you can still be a pilot, but you will never fly fighters. So in this particular individual's case, he disclosed during the interview process that he had been skiing as a teenager and had been knocked unconscious. I think he'd hit a tree, and that disclosure was enough to derail his hopes of going into aviation.
Wow.
Now, I don't know if that's still the case. It wouldn't surprise me if it was, but I don't know definitively. This was 20 plus years ago. But his disclosure that he suffered a concussion as a teenager immediately eliminated him from aviation. And he ended up, after 3.5 years of working hard at the academy, ended up going into surface warfare, which sounds much cooler than it is. Surface warfare is being on board ship. So he was what we call a black shoe in the Navy. So yeah, his whole dream of being a naval aviator was dashed with that single disclosure.
So from the beginning, did you know that your goal was to be a fighter pilot?
Yes. From the time that I was a kid, I joke about this, although there's some truth in it. I grew up pretty poor, and I told you already, my mom was a crossing guard, and she bought encyclopedias from the grocery store. And I know, like, somebody right now listening to this, especially if they're from a different generation, are like, what's an encyclopedia? Right. I know what Wikipedia is, but like, what's an encyclopedia? And so she bought encyclopedias. And back in the day, they sell them door to door, and you'd buy them in grocery stores. And I know it's a dated reference, but she couldn't afford the entire set. And we only had up through the letter N. And, but one of the things I'm grateful for is that we had the letter A. And so I started reading through the encyclopedias, and I found the word astronaut. And from that moment on, I was obsessed with the idea. And so as far as being a fighter pilot, it was part of an intermediate step that would ultimately lead, I hope, to NASA and being an astronaut. And that obsession, when I read those things, and maybe that was really the impetus or the catalyst to why I did well academically through grade school and everything else, was that I knew some things, and I knew that those guys were very strong academically. They're also physically fit, and they had a certain type that they were looking for. And so I became very committed at an early age to that path. And it was totally an internal issue. But so when I went to the Naval Academy, I was always obsessed and with that idea that I wanted to be a fighter pilot, which would lead to a bigger ambition of mine, which was to serve as an astronaut.
You said that they had specific standards or things that they look for that you were already priming yourself for?
Yes. And there's a funny side note to this as well, which I swear is true. But ultimately, yes, to be an astronaut, it's pretty well known. There are definitely certain characteristics that they're looking for, certain experiences, especially from the pilot side. I mean, I knew that there were also mission specialists, but especially if you go back to the early programs like the Mercury astronauts or the Gemini or Apollo, they were all pilots. It wasn't until really the space shuttle came along that you started to see mission specialists and civilians, although in all fairness, there were civilians. I mean, a lot of people don't know it, but even Neil Armstrong was technically a civilian when he walked on the moon. So there were civilians in the space program, but for the most part, they had all come from military backgrounds, the Air Force, the Navy, Marine Corps, guys like John Glenn, and most of them, had come from the fighter community. It was really later on in the 80s when you started to see the space shuttle program that you started to see mission specialists who came from the civilian side or who had been naval flight officers. On that note, one of the books, because we talked about books, that I would recommend is Riding Rockets by Mike Mullane, who it's one of the best reads that I've had in the last year or two. Phenomenal books. I'll say it again, is Riding Rockets by Mike Mullane. Well worth your time. He did 3 space shuttle missions, very candid look at how that program was laid out, and just hilarious stories that he tells about the whole experience. But going back to your original question about kind of knowing what was going to be required, absolutely. I knew that they were strong academically, they were strong physically, they were strong pilots. And then the funny side note was I remember seeing a reference to a height requirement or a disqualifying if they exceeded a certain height. And I remember as a kid being told that I was going to be taller than 6 foot tall. And I swear I mentally willed myself to to not exceed 6 feet because I had read as a kid, and it's still ingrained in my head that was a disqualifier. And so I am 5'11". So yes.
Right at the height you need to be.
Absolutely.
What do you consider your greatest military accomplishment and why?
I accomplished a lot of things in the military over an 11-year career, but probably the easiest thing to point to is the fact that I became an F-18 pilot, which was my goal. I'm proud of being a Marine. I'm proud of, and notice that I just used the present tense there. I am a Marine. I am not a former Marine or an ex-Marine. I am a Marine, and
That's
I will.
How Marines talk.
Absolutely.
I've never heard a Marine say
and
it
it wasn't even conscious.
way.
Yeah, no, it wasn't even conscious that it came out that way, but it's absolutely true. I'm proud of being a Marine. And I wear the Eagle Globe and Anchor, and I still get the lump in my throat, when I hear the Marine Corps hymn, or when I see a Marine in uniform. I still feel that brotherhood. So I think I could point to that and just say, just being a Marine in and of itself was my greatest accomplishment. And you're always a Marine first. That's one of the things. I can sit there and say I was a Marine F-18 pilot, and I can talk to you about being a pilot or flying the Hornet, but the reality of it is you're always a Marine first. So I'm very proud of being a Hornet pilot, and it led me to great success in the civilian world afterwards, but just being a Marine in and of itself.
What do you think is the most important thing you learned as being a Marine? What does that mean to you?
I can take this in any number of directions. There is as you know from your Air Force experience, there is definitely an inter-service rivalry.
Sure.
And I take great pride in having served my country. I love the United States, and you love it for all of its faults and all of its beautiful aspects as well. But I think that inter-service rivalry is ultimately a good thing. Being a Marine is definitely special. I have my biases and I have my opinions about the other services. I am appreciative to all services, to even include, the Coast Guard. I think those guys do an incredibly noble job, and they are some of the best individuals I've ever met. And technically they don't fall under the Department of Defense. A lot of people don't understand that. They associate the Coast Guard as being part of the military, but they're not part of the Department of Defense. But I went to flight school with a lot of those guys, so I have tremendous respect for them. But each of the services have kind of their own little fingerprint, if you will. And being a Marine, and I'll repeat that it is something very special. we take pride in doing more with less. We know we're the redheaded stepchildren of the armed services. And I'll throw out my bias and tell you, the Air Force gets all the good toys. They get all the newest stuff. There's always the joke between the inter services, how the Marine Corps, the Navy, how they do things. Like when the Air Force builds a base, an air base, they first put in the officers club and the enlisted club and the golf course and all the really nice amenities. And then they go back to Congress and go, hey, we need more money for the runway. Right? The Marine Corps, in its infinite wisdom, puts in the runway and then goes back to Congress and goes, hey, we need more money for the golf course and for for all this other stuff. And of course, it's really easy for Congress to go, yeah, no, we're not giving you more money for that. So, so we end up living in tents and I can't tell you, I remember one of the funnier moments was an Air Force crew that was repositioning my squadron overseas, and we put them up in our bachelor officers quarters, and I was, one of my collateral duties was as the supply officer for the squadron, and so I was overseeing their putting them up in the hotels or the BOQ, and they told me that it was considered substandard housing and that they demanded that we put them up in the hotels out in town.
Really?
No, I wouldn't make it up. And that's, and I've stayed in Air Force BOQs and they are very posh, it's very nice compared to a Marine BOQ where the paint's coming off the walls and the ceiling tiles are falling out. It's definitely worlds apart.
So the stories have relevance?
Absolutely.
What behavior or skill did you learn in the military that has most impacted your life?
To point at any single skill, I don't know. We talked a little bit beforehand about really what I would consider kind of a list of things that you draw from the military that I think set us apart from our civilian counterparts. I'll hit the high points first, just kind of the bullets, and then maybe touch upon some individual ones. We talked a little bit about stress management, which is something that I think that we do exceptionally well in the military compared to our civilian counterparts, is that right from the outset, when you go into basic training or when you go into officers candidate school and you're dealing with drill instructors, they create stress from day one. And oftentimes it's this artificial stress that at the time seems a little bit ridiculous, and it is to some extent. But what they're really preparing you for is a much more stressful event. Ultimately, they're preparing us for combat. And so as a result, you start to understand how to manage stress, which helps a lot later on in life. So stress management, attention to detail. Something that is emphasized from the beginning is just seeing the big picture, but being very focused, having that laser-like focus that you can see all of the nuances that will set you apart again from civilians who have a tendency to not nearly be as focused on the small things. Tenaciousness, that can-do attitude, that I'm not going to quit. And that's what sets many of us apart in the military, even within the service. And we can talk about that a little bit. But as an example, just as a side note, when you talk about the SEALs, and they're obviously very iconic in what they have accomplished, but when you talk to those guys, a lot of them will tell you that really what sets them apart is the fact that they just don't quit. It's not that they're necessarily the fastest or the strongest, or it's not ringing that bell,
right?
And not throwing in the towel, to use whatever analogy you want to use. Like, they just don't quit. They don't know the meaning of the word, And so that tenaciousness, that desire, no retreat, no surrender mindset that the military can help you to foster. Teamwork. Definitely a big part of being in the military. From the beginning, we were definitely told that, there are no individuals. That, when one person messes up, we all pay for it. Or, our success is not any one individual. Teamwork is emphasized from the beginning. And, we all go down together. We lock arms. We talked a little bit about Admiral McRaven's speech that he gave, and I would encourage anyone listening to this when they're done to go onto YouTube and find that speech that he gave at the University of Texas, the commencement speech. If you haven't heard it already, it's well worth your time. And he talks about SEAL training and the lessons that he learned from it. So again, Admiral McRaven at the University of Texas commencement speech, worth your time. And the ability to suffer. So, as a last bullet point, that ability to suffer, and I told you the quote that I really like from Napoleon, and to give you the abbreviated version of it, effectively what he said was, the greatest attribute of a soldier, and I'll give you the actual quote here, but was the ability to suffer. And I would take it one step further to say the ability to suffer in silence. We joke a lot about how Marines aren't happy, or probably you hear the same thing in the Air Force, like they're just not happy unless they're bitching. You'll hear that term, right? That's a happy Marine is a complaining Marine. But I think that can also, suffering in silence has the advantage of not creating negativity throughout the unit. And so there's some camaraderie that's created by complaining together,
yes,
but it can also be destructive.
Right.
So it kind of transcends suffering, but like to take it to the next step, and like the ability to suffer in silence. And what Napoleon actually said was the first virtue in a soldier is endurance of fatigue, and courage is only the second virtue. And again, what he meant there, I think, is that that courage is important in a soldier, but the ability to just endure and, to suffer through hardship. So that's another thing. So to go back to your question, what lessons did I learn from the military? To repeat it, stress management, attention to detail, that tenaciousness, that I'm not going to quit mentality, teamwork, and the ability to suffer.
I think the ability to suffer is really great. And I love the way that Napoleon said that. It's so perfectly, eloquently stated. What books have been influential to your life or your career?
One of the things that I did at the Academy is I've always loved history. And so I've been a student of history. And there are a lot out there. There are a lot of different books that you can read on any number of great leaders. And you can pick from a wide array. Specific books on leadership. There are some great ones out there that are modern day books. And I can think of several titles. But I would rather kind of focus on the individual leaders who I think truly distinguish themselves. I am a huge fan of Alexander the Great. I think that he lives up to the name. He definitely had, there's like anyone, there's definitely a dark side. And I am not unaware of that. But being a student of history and getting in there, I think that what he brought in particular was, and we talked about this, what is the most important tenet or principle of leadership? And that is leadership by example. If I were to summarize what I've learned from leadership, it's that one thing, is that you always lead by example. Leadership is about leading from the front, being proactive, and seeing problems before they manifest, and taking corrective actions before, again, they turn into crisis. Managers, and we talked about this, and I will come back to your book question, and we'll come back to Alexander the Great, I swear. But leadership versus management. Leadership is about being proactive, being out in front. Management is about being reactive and being in a constant state of crisis management. And that's where I differentiate the two. And what Alexander the Great did in particular is that he was a true battlefield commander who he cared about his troops. He led from the front. He actually, he suffered any number of injuries. I think there were at least 10 life-threatening injuries as he campaigned across Asia and into Africa. And there are things about Alexander the Great that will just blow your mind if you've never actually investigated it, how he actually went in and invaded Egypt and was actually named Pharaoh. And a lot of people don't know that, and how he ultimately went across Asia and invaded India, and how he inspired his men throughout. He knew the names of individuals. He fought beside them on the battlefield, almost to his detriment, but he had great vision from the battlefield to be able to do that. And then he would visit his troops who were wounded in the aftermath, and took a very caring nature of his men. And that's important too. And as far as specific books, there are any number of books that are out there. There are great books on leadership themselves. I have some issues with the individuals who wrote these, but I think the lessons are important. One of them is Extreme Ownership, that's out there.
I love it. I love script.
Jocko does a great job. He's a very intense individual, and there are a lot of lessons to be garnered from his work.
Yes.
And that is an important thing, is taking ownership and being accountable. And that's a recurring message that he puts out there.
Yes. So
of the modern books that are out there, for sure, but definitely become a student of history and look at some of the greats, and you'll find out that, that they were flawed individuals. We, as Americans, we look at Grant in the American Civil War, and you find out that he was a very flawed individual. But he knew how to get the job done with brute force, unfortunately. You can look at guys like MacArthur and Eisenhower in World War II. There were other great commanders in World War II as well, like Nimitz and Halsey and Omar Bradley and others. They faced the most challenging situation probably in world history and had to make some very hard decisions. And so I would say, become a student of history. When you say what books, it's more just take an active interest in history.
So for you, it was more fitting or effective to learn about people from history instead of reading about skill sets from a book?
Well, I think that you learn about both. As you learn about the individual and you find out that these were real human beings and the challenges that they faced as humans, their flaws, their foibles, their idiosyncrasies and quirks and everything else. Mm-hmm. But you also, you learn about their mistakes and their accomplishments, and you learn from both. You can't make every mistake that's out there. I referenced earlier about how you learn more from a failure than you do from a success. And you can't experience all of those things firsthand. So the only alternative is to learn from the mistakes of others. And whether that's through reading or through observation. And I talked to you about in the civilian world how I was a sim instructor for years. And I consider myself to be a very good pilot today. I'm still not perfect, but I'm a very, very good pilot. But part of my success and why I consider myself a good pilot today is because the number of mistakes that I witnessed over my span of time as an instructor. And I said to you earlier that I learned more as an instructor than I ever taught. And a large part of that was, a lot of it was just being asked questions that I had to go and research. Never be afraid to say, I don't know, I'll find out. But also just watching mistakes that other people made. And the only way that you can do that, on a broader perspective as a leader, is to be that student of history. And I know it's a recurring theme, but, be that lifelong learner, learn from your own mistakes, but learn from the mistakes of others.
If you could give new enlistees one skill set or superpower to help them in their career in the future of the military, what would it be?
It goes back, if it's a superpower, is that ability to learn. And again, it's a recurring theme. Today, the military is a very interesting place because of the amount of experience that is there. This country has been at war now for 17, 18 years as we record this in 2019. We started fighting in Afghanistan in 2001. We invaded Iraq shortly thereafter. So there is just a wealth of experience. And there was definitely a gap from the Vietnam War. The highlights at post-Vietnam were things like Grenada and Panama. They made movies about Grenada, Heartbreak Ridge with Clint Eastwood is about the Grenada invasion. And so that's how little there was going on. And then we had the Gulf War, the first one, Gulf War One, and then the second Gulf War post September 11th. So to answer your question about like what superpower would I give to an enlistee, is a lot of it is going to be respectful and to keep your mouth shut and your ears open. Like I guess I would give them super hearing. Like you have an incredible opportunity to learn from those who have been there and done that and have paid an incredible price to do it, whether it's within their personal lives or in their professional lives. And so seize that opportunity. You are in the presence of greatness, and they may not always seem it. You can definitely be judgmental and you'll find flaws because again, they're human. So like there are plenty of flaws to be found in your superiors, but just realize that many of them have been through some very harrowing experiences. And even if they weren't exactly, on the front lines in combat, they have still been through a lot. And so you are uniquely positioned today to learn from those who have been there, done that, and have the experience. Absolutely.
Is there anything we're missing?
Yeah, I mean, the most important thing that I would tell anyone today, and I don't care if it's military or civilian, this is something which we spoke about, is become obsessed with self-improvement. Today in this society, it is so easy to achieve. I think you can achieve great things through hard work because, and I don't mean to criticize the current generation. I'll leave that to any listener to make their own determinations in that regard. But things are very easy. And I don't want to be that guy who reminisces on my own life. And I had it so much harder when I was a kid and had to work so much harder. No, not necessarily. It's always true. You can absolutely achieve great things through hard work. Don't let anyone else outwork you. You may not be the smartest, you may not be the fastest, you may not be the strongest, but you should be the hardest working person out there. And so that's the big thing. And be obsessed with that personal development. And a lot of what I would have to say, I told you this earlier, might come across as trite in that you've heard it before, or hackneyed, you can use whatever term you want. When you hear someone say, like competition has its value, competing with other people, and it's really what drives us. But ultimately, the only person you want to compete with is yesterday's version of you. There's the Michael Douglas quote is pretty famous from Wall Street. I know it's a dated reference. You probably haven't even seen the movie, but there's it's Gordon Gekko when he stands up and he says, greed is good. And the reality of it is it's not greed that actually perpetuates us or drives us to be accomplished. It's actually envy. Greed can only get you so far. It's envy and competition. And so there's value in it in that it will push you, but it pushes you for the wrong reasons. It pushes you to accomplish and to maybe outperform, competing with the Joneses or competing with others. And there is some value in it. I won't lie and completely dismiss it, but just realize that it is a very negative aspect. And ultimately, the one person you want to compete with is yourself, and hopefully that's enough. If you really want to feel satisfied and you never want to be satisfied. You never want to be complete. You want to always constantly be moving towards some new target. If you climb a mountain, go climb another one, climb a bigger one. But try to avoid that competition with others as much as you can because of the negative aspect of it.
Well, Scott, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking time for the interview and taking time to really think of what's important to you to pass down to the younger enlisted generation.
Absolutely. I'm happy to do it.
I hope you enjoyed this episode and found a new mindset to help you excel. I liked when Scott talked about having great pride in doing more with less. If there's somewhere in your life now where you wished you had more money, support, or energy, I challenge you to take this as an opportunity to develop your own sense of pride in doing more with less. A little resourcefulness can carry you a long way. If you want to read Scott's bio or read his suggestions for further study, please visit tamfpodcast.com/F18.